All right, recording is started. Welcome everybody to the Network Plumbing Working Group meeting for Thursday, August 16th, 2018. We have a couple items on the agenda. First up is Doug with conformance testing for V1. Take it away.
All right, generally should be a quick one, but one thing that has come up is how can we verify that the reference implementations actually conform to the test? So I think that it might be wise to create an independent project that is for conformance testing. So that way it's not biased towards a reference implementation, but can be used for any reference implementation. I'm guessing it's going to be non-trivial to create, and it might have to start in modest with, kind of verifying a few things. So anyways, basically I wanted to bring it up, see if anyone else had any other considerations for it, and to gauge anyone else's interest in participating in creating some of these conformance tests. I figure we would start with a V1, of course, and it might be one of those things that takes a while to create, and then maybe we could make it so that it can walk backwards once we have multiple versions of this thing to see which version you're compatible with, etc. So any other thoughts on that one from anyone?
Well, since this is all about registered things, this is going to beg the question: which CNI plugins are going to be tested?
So yeah, I can't deny the fact that the first thing that I would test is Multis, because I'm involved with creating it. So I'd want to test that. But by the same token, I would be there's a reference implementation moving along with Courier, and then if Peter starts to further implement the specification in Knitter, I'd love to test it against that. In this case, I think it's a more the merrier kind of thing.
So you actually were looking at a different question than I was. So my question was, you're focusing on the plugin that does the implementation. I was focusing on the plugins that are referenced in the source. Right? When someone writes a spec, they ask for particular plugins to get used.
Mike, this is probably me just being tired at the end of the day, but I am not picking up on what you're throwing down. I apologize.
So if I write a network attachment description, it's going to call for the use of a particular CNI plugin. Right? What plugins are we going to test? Right? It's going to say...
Oh, I gotcha. Okay. Yeah, now I know what you mean. Okay. Yeah, I guess TBD in that particular, from that angle.
Well, let's just stop and think about this. This actually kind of is a big, interesting question. I mean, I had been approaching this with some, networking stuff that I have worked with in mind. But now I wonder, do any of the standard plugins, they have behavior that would be appropriate for use here?
I mean, those would be good targets for that, for sure.
Does anybody else have an opinion?
The more the merrier.
Okay, but do you think that any of the existing or standard plugins have behavior that behave such that if they were referenced from a network attachment description, that we would actually get a good result.
Yeah, I would expect most of them to work, but I would not expect 100%. But I would consider that stuff probably a bug, and we definitely want to fix that. So I think you're right in that respect that we also probably do want to test the CNI reference plugins and fix any of the bugs that we have there, because at least I expect some of those plugins to be used fairly heavily in this framework. So,
okay, so that's a good starting point.
Yeah, the question there, I think, is which reference or which implementation do we use that implements this spec to call those?
Now that part surprised me. I'm sorry. I thought the whole point of a conformance test was you can apply it to different implementations.
Yes. Yep.
Right. So the conformance test is not going to be built to Multus. It's not going to be built to Courier. Right. It's going to be a thing that we can apply to Multus and apply to Courier and whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, totally. And that's why I think it should be created independently of those things, and that this.
Right. So it should be. So there's not a question about that. It's independent of those. We should be able to apply it to anything that claims to be an implementation of this spec.
Yes. Yep.
I guess the other question, maybe this is what you're trying to get at. The other question I have is really a product versus service type of question. Are we simply defining a conformance test as a piece of code that somebody could run? Or are we defining it as a CI pipeline that we stand up somewhere that continually tests something?
Well, that's certainly better than I was assuming it would be an application that somebody could run and they could put it in their own CI pipeline. But if we could get it to the point where we could host it somewhere and offer that service to whatever implementation, then I think that's even better. But
that would be nice, but I feel like, even just starting from the point of, as step one, having that kind of framework that you could just, download and run inside whatever environment you've already configured for your plugin would be good.
Yeah, I think that would be step one.
So definitely.
Right. So
yep.
I guess we'll start there.
Yep. Yeah. So it seems like everybody who's spoken up so far is in general agreement that it would be great to have this kind of thing. What resources do we have to make it happen is question number 2.
I would be willing to put some time into writing it.
Okay. Awesome.
I'm not really familiar with writing things in a way. I've written tests that I run in my own totally unique way. I expect there may be some expectations here. I'm not quite sure what they are or how to meet them. I mean, do I just get to make up, any kind of code I want? I guess we'll think about this. I guess what I would need is, all it really needs is, I need some code that is given a kubeconfig file, and it's going, in my code, my conformance test is going to create some pods, and we're going to create some of these objects, these network attachment description objects, and then create some pods that reference them, and I guess use an image in those pods that I can actually exercise to see if it has the desired connectivity.
Yeah, and it could even be based off like hack local up cluster or something like that, such that hack local up cluster is part of the script that runs and kicks off the test. And then you would give Cube the CNI plugin of the thing you're going to test, and then, which would be supplied by the user because that's their implementation. And then, the script or whatever framework, it doesn't have to be a script, obviously, but whatever framework is running this would then run through all the individual tests. And I think we'd like it to be easy to add more tests if we can, obviously. So, having a fairly well-organized suite.
So first off, it wouldn't be a random application. It would, in fact, be a test suite using the Go.
At least that's how I would approach it, maybe.
Yeah, that's natural enough.
Yeah. At first I thought about having kind of like a fake kube implementation, but I don't think that would work because, we are kind of testing against an actual Kubernetes, and the plugins would probably expect a full API server implementation here, as well as obviously a full container, whether that's run by, Docker, Cryo, whatever it happens to be. I don't know if we can assume too much about what the implementations are going to actually require.
So I was thinking in the first instance, if I write a test suite, right, the test suite itself doesn't hook up to, Minikube or Kube local up or anything, right? It's just a test suite. Something else will maybe bring up a cluster and then apply the test suite to the cluster.
Yes, that we could, yeah. If we want to go even simpler, definitely.
I mean, I would think that would be the place to start because, again, I think the whole point of a conformance test, right, is you can apply it wherever you want. So we don't want a conformance test that only works on Kube local up.
Yeah, so you're right. I think in that case, then not that we have to design it here, but the inputs would basically be an API server and some directories potentially in which we could drop the config files that we might write. And then that test, you just run the test and the test goes off, add some objects to an existing Kubernetes server or Kubernetes cluster given that API server. It might write some config files to the given directory, and then it would test, wait the appropriate amount of time after creating a pod, make sure the pod is up, and then after the pod was up, kind of poll for the status annotation, for example. And then, if 5 minutes have passed and there's no status annotation, failed. Maybe something like that would be the simplest case.
Right. So I presume that in a Go test suite, there's a way to get a parameter such as the name of a kube config file. Right?
Yeah, I mean, you can do basically whatever you want there. You can do command line parameters. You could do a config file, that kind of thing. The test suite can read whatever it wants to off disk, and you can probably access,
Right.
args, etc.
Right.
So.
Okay. Since we're in a cloud native world, this test suite could be delivered as a binary.
Mm-hmm.
It could be a binary that expects details in surrounding or near configured directories, or it could be a container that has all those things, or maybe a container that has some openness for directories.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a container that uses a config map. Obviously, if we're talking, since we're talking Kubernetes, it might need to have a service account or something like that, or at least permission.
Well, right. It could be just something that runs in the cluster, so it wouldn't need a kube config parameter.
No, it wouldn't. You're right, because it could pull the API server address out of the container environment.
Right. It would need a service account with sufficient authorization.
Yep. And it would probably also need the container would need different mappings for host directories depending on where the implementation would look for config files if it used those.
Well, now wait a minute. The implementation of this spec, we're assuming is already in the cluster. Right? We're just going to exercise it.
Yes, but one of the parts of the spec is reading CNI config JSON off disk from a given directory.
Right. Okay.
So we need to make sure that that was mapped into this pod so that this particular container could write config files there to test that aspect of the spec. Which I don't think is a huge problem. It's just mapping a directory in.
No, but this is something that has to exist on every node, right?
Yeah, it would.
I
You also have to make sure that CNI plugins that you were testing, if we do test additional CNI plugins like you were suggesting, Mike, so say, for example, one of the sidecar networks is like Mac VLAN or something like that. We would have to also make sure that the Mac VLAN plugin was installed on all the nodes that this pod could theoretically run on. But that's fine. We could bundle some of those reference plugins into this container. And since it's a performance suite, we can impose some restrictions on the configuration of Kubernetes, for example. There's like a CNI binder option for kubelet and we could potentially require that that option is pointed towards a given directory, or at least that we know that of that directory, and that we could install given CNI plugins in there. And I think we could do some gymnastics with the plugins such that if we have access to that directory from the container, we can, to make sure that we don't conflict with existing plugins, we could copy those into the host directory that's mapped from the container with a different name, and then use that in the config. So I don't know. I feel like in my mind there's ways around some of these problems, but we should just start simple, and maybe just even just make sure the default network comes up and adds the status annotation, and then we can kind of grow organically from there.
Yeah. I'm not real enthused about imposing a lot of restrictions. Right. I would think for conformance tests, we want it to be as widely applicable as possible.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, we may be getting into more details than we need to in this meeting right here.
Sure.
I'll give it some thought and see what I can outline.
Okay. Awesome. Thanks for volunteering on that, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, for
Hey,
sure.
before we talk about the mechanics of this test itself, I would think you want to come up with a actual test plan and description of what are the tests you actually want to test for, right? So I think that's the first effort I would imagine. So
yeah, it's a good idea too.
And I would think you can probably when even include that as part of the spec or a separate document, but that's fine. But I think we should have a document that says, okay, we should test, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually kind of a big spec. By the time we get done with it, I'm hoping I don't have to write tests for all of it. I'll
Right.
I'm offering to kind of try to get the ball rolling here, but this is not my top priority, so I can't promise too much.
I totally understand that, Mike. I also, I'll probably have some more bandwidth here as we move into the fall, but yeah, I'd be more than happy to pitch in with you there. But if you have some, opinions on how you'd like to get it started, if that will make it more appealing to work on, I'm just happy to jump in and write some of the tests or improve the framework with you, etc.
So I guess the next question there is, where should that code live?
Yeah, yes.
How about we can have it right now in Multis, which is the reference implementation.
Well, don't we have a contrib place for kube stuff?
Yeah, there are some kube directory or kube projects we could use. I was going to put the spec in the Kubernetes community repo, but I don't think that's necessarily the right place for a test suite like this. Another alternative is we could still create a project in CNI, a completely separate repo in CNI for the test suite and the spec itself.
Yeah, but it seems to me this is part of kube, so I think the kube contrib is
more kube
right.
related. Okay. We can definitely explore that. I can try to figure out where I would suggest that it would go. If anybody else has suggestions as well. Maybe add these to the agenda doc for next time.
I imagine it could be in the queue because the CNA is generic actually. So, but the most of the spec or the reference implementation, what we are doing is based on cube actually. So that's what I'm also thinking.
Yep. I hope I've captured that in the agenda doc, those 2 work items. All right. Anything else on that topic, or do we feel like we've got a good base to start from?
That covered more than I thought we would cover this go around. So thank you guys, appreciate it.
Yeah, I got nothing more right now.
Okay, excellent. All right, Karal, you're up. Discussion regarding V2 considerations document.
Yeah, so I see Doug's has put some good documentation on the number of futures we can take up for the spec 2 discussion. So I just want to get the community opinion that what are the futures you guys looking into actually to be there actually. So if we go into the documentation, we can see there is around 15 items. So, but if possible, we can take at least 6 items or something to be put in the spec 2, or I think the most of them are kind of implementation or the spec details. That's my second topic, whether we want to separate the spec and the implementation separately, and we have to specify that what is the spec scope and what is the implementation scope around the version 2. So just wondering, like, what are the items you guys think should be in spec 2, or which is should be in the long run you see something the spec should do?
Yeah, kind of along those lines. A question I have for the group is, should we do fairly quick iterations with small items and cleanups, and then continue having discussions on some of the larger items as we go along, and then once discussions on those larger items kind of come to consensus, add those to the spec? I mean, it seems like my thought there is, it seems like we have a number of kind of small, fairly fairly not contentious items and cleanups that hopefully wouldn't take a lot. But then we also have some much larger items that would require some more research, POCs, that kind of thing. And my personal feeling is that it would be good to get those cleanups in, but at the same time, we kind of want to balance churn in the spec and not continuously releasing new versions of the spec that make changes against getting features out or getting things added to the spec that would be useful for people or that eliminate pain points that currently exist in it. So, I mean, in terms of cadence, hopefully we could do something a little bit better than we've done so far, whether that's maybe every 3 months, every 6 months, something like that. Any thoughts from the group? Historical perspective, we only started this effort about 6 to 8 months ago. And so, looking at where we've come in 6 to 8 months, it seems like it's taken longer than that, but it really hasn't been a lot of time, when you put it in perspective.
Yeah.
So when you say release every 3 months, is that V2, V3, or are you wanting to get into dot releases too?
Well, and thinking about 3 months now, I feel like maybe that's a little too quick.
Right.
Because we're talking about, if we release a new version of the spec, how many people are going to be able to update to that spec in 3 months and roll that out? We don't want this to necessarily, or at least I don't want this to necessarily be a treadmill where the spec is constantly changing. I want a pretty good spec that's locked for a little bit. We work on V2, but that said, since this is our first version, are there things that are pain points right now that we could fix in the spec, or small things we could add to the spec and maybe roll out like a 1.5 or call it V2? I don't think version numbers mean everything in the world, but they do convey some information, so you kind of have to manage some of the expectations around them, if that makes sense. I guess I haven't made my mind up. I'm kind of looking for guidance from the group here around what everybody feels, especially people who have worked on implementations of this. What you think the cadence should be, how often we should add updates to the spec, or if there are specific things that are really blocking you from implementing parts of this. How can we fix that, and how quickly should we do that?
I certainly am open to hearing other people's needs, but I will say, it does take a fair amount of work to implement this stuff. And, there's part of me that's like excited to work on some of this upcoming stuff, but then there's another part of me that says, hey, development is only a small percentage of what you do. The other half is stabilizing and maintaining, what you do, or better than half, I should say. So there's part of me that would say 3 months sounds a little bit short. So I think that I'd say that maybe thinking about a 6-month cadence for the next one might not be terrible, but I guess depending on people's zest for entering or working on these upcoming items, etc. So, I don't know. Happy to hear any input there, what people might be blocked on or are just totally missing out on. I know Peter had some stuff there that was like just a little bit close for this, and it might be one of those things where maybe we think about having some sort of amendments period before we do like a big spec update or whatever, and we could say, hey, can we triage some of the smaller stuff to like make a 1.1 or something like that, because I don't want anyone else's implementations to be left behind because of what might be missing and what might not meet their needs. So I certainly don't want to say, oh, hey, let's only do 6 months and sorry, you're out of luck if your stuff didn't make it into version 1. So I think that's unfair, but I think for like the like big version 2.0, maybe a little bit longer on that. That's kind of how I'm thinking of it at the moment, at least.
I'm second on that.
What do you guys think that the implementation we can put like version 1.123? If there is a major change in the spec, we can go for version 2.0.
And maybe, yeah, and you know what? Maybe 3 months does sound good for a like dot release. And I know that it's getting kind of fine grained to be like, oh, the dot release of this thing, but
that sounds fine to me to start out with. We could always kind of change the cadence later if we want to. We try it out, see if it works, and if we need to modify things, we do that. If we do, what we should do regardless is we should probably go through this list and identify the things that we think are kind of small cleanups, and maybe target those. Talk about 1 or 2 of those every meeting and see if we can make some progress on the small things, but then also, leave perhaps the bulk of the time for the meetings to discuss issues people have when they're doing POCs or other experimentation with the larger things here. Because I think there is a pretty good split between things that are going to take a long time and have a lot of discussion and things that are probably just small fixes or mechanical changes. I see. Go ahead.
Can we use the version policy like Kubernetes does? Kubernetes API does. For example, we will use V2 Alpha 1 and V2 alpha beta, something like that. And the alpha version would be optional for the implementation, and the beta would be mandatory or something like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. All right, what does everybody think we should do on this one?
Yeah, I think that Peter's idea there is pretty reasonable to say like, hey, this is the stuff that you are is a must, and this other stuff is a may. But yeah, I think that probably the next thing for the group to do is let's see what the low hanging fruit is here, and definitely people should speak up if there's stuff that they're like, it was just too late to get that in V1, and we can kind of check out the scope on it and see what we need.
It almost feels like if we're going to do that fine grain, it's way too, I don't know that we have that many things to really indicate for each one this is alpha or beta feature. I almost feel like your original suggestion then was just fine. Let's say if we just release, let's say 3 months, we're going to release a dot release, and then in 6 months we're going to release the next major version. Do something like that and then adjust, right? Like I don't know that we need to come up with very, very detailed policy on releasing and version number and that kind of stuff. We can just we can look at the list of V2, identify those that are just minor changes, and then just work on those first and go ahead and release a 1.5 or something, or 1.1, and then just work on the bigger things and put that as 2. And that should, seems like that should be fine for the next 6 months or so at least.
Yeah, I think we're speculating too much here. Let's go ahead and try doing some of the work and see what cadence we think we can actually sustain. I'm concerned it would be easy to just pick off small things and bike shed them for a long time. I think we should probably ask ourselves to spend part of our time on the small things and part of our time on the big things. Otherwise, the big things will never happen.
Yep. Again, all that sounds reasonable to me. And, like Feng said, let's just pick something and try it out for a little bit and, circle back around. If it worked, great. If it didn't, let's change it.
Yep. Sounds good.
+1.
All right.
So when do we want to actually go over that list? Is that something we want to do in one of this meeting, or is that a different?
I think given that people have been adding like 6 more new items to the considerations for V2, we should probably take the next 2 weeks and just make sure that every unicorn anybody wants is on the list.
Okay.
Obviously within reason, and then at the next meeting actually sit down and try to put things into buckets of, we think this is a short-term feature. We think this is a long-term feature. For some of the long-term features, we should probably have some discussions about whether anybody's done experiments or POCs with it to get some real-world experience, because I feel like, we probably shouldn't be adding things to the spec unless somebody has a really good idea of the issues around it or what's required with it. And then, hopefully at that point in 2 weeks, we'll have a good idea of, what the next 3 months of work is, if that makes sense.
Nice. Very good. Sounds good.
Cool.
Let me add some notes on that count to the agenda doc. Were there other things to talk about there in the your section, Corral?
Sorry, I was mute.
Yeah, no problem.
So that's what I was thinking, that we should prioritize what are the items. I mean, the next action items for 2 weeks, right? So we have currently, I put a lot of items actually there right now. So whatever is coming to my mind. So it's currently like 20 items is there. So we can't do all these items. I just want to have some discussion on certain items. It's not that it should be part of the spec, but just a discussion or the idea how it could be in Kubernetes. So I just want to know what are the action items we have to take for next 2 weeks in order to um, take up this document, whatever Doug has put into a list of something like prioritizing these things. How we can do it actually. That's what I want to ask you guys. Do you want to put some kind of voting mechanism, or this is something I want to do it, or what do you guys think?
Looking at the list, I mean, just picking two off of it, I feel like bandwidth capability flags, for example, is something that's going to be a fairly uncontroversial, fairly short-term thing. Whereas what about network service mesh is definitely going to be a much longer topic. I feel like it would be good to have a section or given that we were going to probably want discussion for these, maybe we should either use Google Doc comments or we can add subpoints below them and people can tag it and say where they think it should go. We probably want to try to get as much of that out of the way as possible before the next meeting so that everyone has a good idea of where they think things are and a good idea of what things are. For example, number 12 VRF, I think I know what that means, but we should make sure that everybody understands what each of these items is, at least to a small degree. And then we can have a better discussion about it because, we only have 1 hour for meetings. And so we want to try to use our time as
exactly
possible.
Right. I've seen the word VRF, for example, but as far as I know, that's something that exists in routers, not in hosts.
So, I mean, also if whoever added some of these items, if you could tag who you are. I know we've got that for some, but if you added it, please tag yourself on those. And then also if you can add a little bit more explanation of that item.
Yes, please.
That would be awesome.
Yeah, having one word is not helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, I was totally confused on VRF.
So does that kind of satisfy the concern, Karal? That just to be clear for everybody, we've got a lot of items on this list. The asks for next time would be to read the list, try to understand what the item is. If you don't understand, ask questions. If you put the item there and somebody asked a question, please explain that. Even better if you explain it on the line itself as opposed to the Google Doc comments. And then anybody else get an idea and even perhaps note it down in the document, whether you think that this is a 3-month thing or whether you think it's like a 6-month thing. And it would also be good, you don't necessarily need to put it down, but if you are willing to work on these items or if you have experiments or POCs that implement them, or even better, maybe presentations that describe work that you've done on this kind of thing in the past, please link those from those items in the V2 document so that everybody can follow those links and ideally we'll have a better idea of what these items are so when we discuss them on the 30th. Does that sound reasonable, everybody?
Yep.
A little bit of homework.
Good.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then Karal, you had asked about a place for the V1 spec. I was still going to put it in the Cube community repo for now under SIG Network and do that PR, but I was in the middle of cleaning up the conversion to Markdown. We had talked about trying to have a Markdown copy online so it'd be easier to view and easier to look stuff up. I used a Markdown converter that converted other things and also kind of collapsed some of the pre-formatted things that I now have to clean up. So I was working through that. I'm about half done. I will try that link that you suggested and see if that does a better job than the one I used. But I'm expecting that in the next week or so, I will have that PR up.
To be fair, it won't do a lot of job actually. It's a very basic tool actually. Yeah.
Well, and
Dan, just
yeah.
to thank you for doing the yeoman's task there
Yeah.
of converting that thing.
You're welcome. I mean, it's pretty mechanical, so it's not that hard. It just takes a little bit of time.
Cool.
All right. Was there anything else to discuss? Anything anybody wants to bring up?
The last one is about the thick plugins and the daemon sets, about the version 2 specs. So you guys have any idea? Because so for all the implementation, we had done it on the CNI, right? So we thought it should be a CNI, but in most of the cases, it can be a CNI, it can't be a CNI. I mean, it can be a daemon set, or it could be a process which can do this work actually, right?
Mhm.
So what is your idea on that work?
Are you thinking about implementations that would not be called initially via CNI, or are you thinking about implementations that would still be called through CNI, but then would not redelegate to other CNI plugins?
So would not delegate to other. For example, if you take both Courier and Multis, right? So Multis do the multi-networking in certain way, Courier does it in certain way. But
Right.
if I want to use both of them in OpenStack Ironic, right? So what will be the model there? So it's the same spec. So Multis implementation will think its own network, and Courier will think, okay, that's my network. So how you could differentiate two different reference implementation try to work together, right? So it's
Yep.
very difficult at the time.
Yeah, and Peter from Red Hat had brought that up, and I actually added that as item 11 in the V2 considerations document. It might not be worded well enough, but that I think was the intent there.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Okay.
No, and you know what? I didn't word that well enough because I described an implementation of that, not the problem that actually exists.
Okay, cool.
So,
Okay, got it.
my fault. But yeah, good point. I think you're the second or third person who's brought that up. So it's something that we should definitely discuss and potentially address for V2 or potentially even sooner than that. But there's probably a lot of discussion around that. So let's just see where we land.
Okay.
All right. We seem to have run out of agenda items. So if there aren't any other things to bring up, I will give people 5 seconds to think of something to talk about. Otherwise, we all get 13 minutes of your life back.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Yep.
Yeah,
Thank you, guys.
All right, bye.
See you in 2 weeks.
Yes, thanks.